And if you're in an executive role, you're in a director role, you're on a board, you're in some kind of significant supervisory context, you're going to be spending up to 80% of your day listening. And the problem is too many people in those contexts are listening to what's said rather than listening to what's not said. And we have a long list of royal commissions in Australia that highlights that the more senior you are, the less likely you are to act on complaints, because we might be systemic at broadcasting information as a business, but we're not systemic about listening to our customers.
Hi everyone, Jeffrey Wang here, and you're listening to the PDF podcast. The Professional Development Forum, or PDF for short, was established to help diverse young professionals reach their potential in the modern Australian workplace. Oscar Trimboli is an author, speaker, and mentor. He is the host of the award-winning Apple podcast, Deep Listening, Impact Beyond Words. Oscar is an industry veteran with over 30 years experience across management, sales, marketing, and operations, working for companies like Microsoft, Polycom, and Vodafone. He now consults to organizations like Google, Qantas, and Macquarie Bank. He's passionate about using the gift of listening to bring positive change in homes, workplaces, and cultures around the world. Through his work with company boards and executives, Oscar has experienced firsthand the impact that leaders can have when they truly listen. He believes that leaders need to focus on building organizations with social impact in order to create powerful legacies for the people they serve, today and more importantly for our future generations. What a privilege for you to join us today, Oscar.
G'day, Jeffrey. Looking forward to listening to your questions.
Thank you, Oscar. Now, I was very excited since we spoke the other day. As you know, as I mentioned to you, one of our members suggested that I should speak to you.
Thanks, Tash.
And you speak about the 5 levels of listening, which I found absolutely fascinating. Can you give me can you briefly explain to us what those 5 levels are?
Yeah, the 5 levels of listening are: first, listening to yourself. That's the level most people skip. Mm-hmm. Level 2, listening to the content. That's what you see, that's what you hear, and what you sense. Level 3 is listening for the context. So you're listening for patterns and backstories. Level 4 is the ninja move. If Yoda from Star Wars was here, he'd say, listen for what's unsaid. Listen for what's unsaid. That's level 4. And then level 5 is listening for their meaning. So those 5 levels of listening kind of help you all make an impact beyond words if you're listening through those levels. But 86% of people, Jeffrey, in our research database, they're stuck at level 1. They've got too many browser tabs open in their mind, thinking about what they're going to have for dinner, what they're going to have for lunch, what they're going to have for a weekend exercise. So they might be thinking about their to-do list. And what's happening for people right now who are listening to this? They're kind of drifting away, wondering why I am not speaking fast enough, because they can hear and listen 4 times faster than I can speak. So that's one of the first things. If we all knew the neuroscience of listening, it would be much simpler for us that we can listen at 4 times faster than someone can speak. So we're programmed to be distracted.
So that's a very interesting fact that you mentioned. You know, you speak of these people stuck on level 1. I feel like I'm probably guilty as charged sometimes. So how does one listen for the 5 levels? Do you have to progress through the levels? Do you have to hit level 1 before you can have any chance of hitting level 2, or can you work on all 5 at the same time?
Yeah, it's funny, because if you think of a martial arts dojo, everybody wants to do the flying back kick. But if you go into a dojo, the first thing they're going to teach you to do is push-ups on your knuckles. And until you master that, you're not really going to move into any more advanced areas than that. Now, for most of us, are we capable of listening at the 5 levels simultaneously? Absolutely, we're human and we can. In fact, the first skill we learn at 20 weeks inside our mother's womb is listening to the sound of our mother. And at 34 weeks, we can distinguish Beethoven from Bon Jovi from Justin Bieber. We can listen to music. So all of us have this innate ability to listen at the 5 levels, but unfortunately, as we move through life, we're a very speaker-centric culture, and we believe that speaking, not listening, is that For most of us, it's very difficult to listen to level 2, 3, 4, and 5 when we just have our own radio station playing in our own head before we get to the conversation, because listening happens before, during, and after the conversation. And for most of us, the simplest thing we can do is move the notification button on our devices, whether that's a Mac or a PC, whether it's an Android device or an iPhone. If you want to double your listening productivity immediately, just switch the notification button to off on your devices. You'll double your listening productivity. Tip number 2, drink a glass of water every half an hour. That'll send a signal to the parasympathetic nervous system, the part of the body that says, should I be freaking out about this? Am I being triggered by what's happening? Or can I just relax and be in the moment? And then tip number 3, to master level 1, take 3 deep breaths. That's how simple it is. In through the nose, down to the bottom of your lungs, and out through your mouth. And if you master that, whether I've interviewed Olympic runners, whether I've interviewed world champion snipers or opera singers, they all have deliberate breath work in their high performance kit bag. So for all of us, if we want to be in the moment, just take 3 deep breaths, and that'll get you present right to the conversation.
One thing you mentioned in another podcast I was listening to that you had was around how important listening is in the corporate world. And specifically that the higher up you go, the more time you will spend listening. Can you delve a bit more into that and why that is the case?
Yeah, so the more senior you are, the more likely the part of your job description involves listening. First-time people manager, you're going to notice really quickly you're moving up into the 60% ranges. Leader of leaders role, so you look after a group of people managers, you're in the 70%. And if you're in an executive role, you're in a director role, you're on a board, you're in some kind of significant supervisory context, you're going to be spending up to 80% of your day listening. And the problem is too many people in those contexts are listening to what's said rather than listening to what's not said. And we have a long list of royal commissions in Australia that highlights that the more senior you are, the less likely you are to act on complaints, because we might be systemic at broadcasting information as a business, but we're not systemic about listening to our customers as a business. And that not only costs us in a regulatory sense or a reputational sense in terms of media, but it's just going to cost us lost customers. And it's not so much the revenue that we're going to miss out on, it's our ability to help them make a bigger impact than what they might otherwise have done. And then great staff will leave much quicker. Everybody says people don't leave organizations, they leave their managers. And the number one reason why they leave their managers, they don't feel like they're being heard. So for many of us in the corporate context, you know, whether projects run over schedule or whether projects are over budget, or even worse, Jeffrey, projects that deliver on time and on budget, but they don't deliver what the original stakeholders ask, that's all a function of a lack of listening.
Okay, so in the risk of opening a Pandora's box.
No, let's open it up. Let's go there.
So there's generally a view that our leaders may not want to hear bad news, which is why we don't send bad news up. Why is it that we have this culture where bad news don't travel where they need to, enough up the chain of command?
Yeah, look, whether I'm working with chief risk officers, chief financial officers, chief operating officers, CEOs, chairs, not one of them would say to me, I don't want to hear bad news. Quite the opposite. They're very open to it. They do want it to travel up fast, but something gets lost between the front line and the top line through a series of summarization. Context is lost. And this is why it's really critical not to transfer information up the chain of command, but to transfer stories about the impact of that issue up the chain of command. So it's one thing to say, total customer satisfaction has declined 12% in this quarter. It's quite another thing to say that there is a significant safety issue with one of our products and it almost killed a child 2 weeks ago. Mary called our contact center and told us the story about an unanticipated thing in our design. So when you tell that story all the way through, you don't have to say anything about it being right or wrong. You just tell the story. So I think the fastest way to transmit information that you want to see change propagated with is to tell a story. I work with a lot of market research companies that get really frustrated. They generate hundreds and hundreds of slides. They call it the door stopper, because when you print out the market research, it's cut by division, it's cut by location, it's cut by age group, it's cut by gender, all these things. And they always say the most simple way to transmit the message is just to tell the story, a real story from somebody from customer contact center or a customer visit, or it might be a written complaint. But too many of us try and transmit a bunch of ingredients as if to say, mincemeat, salt, pepper, garlic, butter, and onions. Now, Jeffrey, what am I making with all those ingredients?
I have no idea.
But you could make burritos, you could make hamburgers, you could make bolognese. And I think too much of what we do is we transmit the ingredients and we don't say what's on the menu. And storytelling is very closely correlated. Great storytelling cultures are great listening cultures. And I think the bit that's lost in translation is we don't tell the story.
Oh, absolutely. So storytelling is almost like joining the dots in terms of the ingredients, right? And that's why great storytelling cultures are good at, I suppose, bringing context to the information that you're trying to transmit. And as a result, the information you're trying to transmit gets to the other side. So that kind of makes sense. So to be a great listener, you have to understand the ingredients of the information that you want. And so being a great listener also makes you a great storyteller then, doesn't it?
Let me take you to our place on a Sunday afternoon. It's about 11:45 and I'm pulling out lasagna, or pasta al forno, as you would say in Italian. That's my grandmother's recipe. And we are shaving freshly grated Parmesan cheese, and the family's all around the dinner table. And we're all going to the grandkids and everybody in between. We're all going to eat this beautiful lasagna with a nice bottle of red wine, and everybody's going to be there telling a story. Now, I told you exactly the same ingredients earlier on, but your mouth is salivating now, without a doubt.
I can smell it as lasagna.
Exactly. So I told you a story about lasagna without telling you anything about mincemeat, onions, garlic, salt, pepper. All those ingredients went in, and I told you that at the beginning. And I think that's the difference between, if you want to be able to transmit a message that's powerful, it's just like I zoomed you in. You could picture yourself at that table. I didn't tell you about the checkered tablecloth and all of that, something that's very proud that my mum gave to me, and that's the centerpiece of Sunday for us. But I think most people don't understand that so much context is transmitted in a story. You can see relationships, you can see history, you can see ingredients, you can see the connection of everybody to that story. And great storytelling cultures are great listening cultures, and there's a reason they're called high context cultures. So the Maori of New Zealand, the Polynesian cultures of the Pacific, the Aboriginal and Indigenous communities of Australia, the Chinese, the Korean, the Japanese, never would ever explain something at an ingredient level. It's always contextual to a relationship between a father and a son. It's contextual to the context of the meal. Words mean different things given the context that they're spoken in those languages. So it's no surprise to me that the greatest listening cultures are also the greatest storytelling cultures as well. In the Daly River of the Northern Territory, Auntie Rose, a great elder there, talks about Dadiri. Dadiri is their mob's word for listening. It means to listen to yourself. It means listen to your peoples and listen to your land. So it's very three-dimensional. And in Mandarin, it's ting. Ting means to listen. It's a very active phrase, and there's 6 dimensions of ting when it comes to listening as well. But in the West, we tend to just go and see and hear. but there's 4 other dimensions in Ting, and one of them is to listen with your heart or with feeling.
Yep.
Another one is to be respectful. Another one is to be focused and present. There are many dimensions when it comes to listening. In that character, that's 6-dimensional, you would have to probably have 7 or 8 sentences to explain it in English.
Yep.
But Ting in Mandarin is a beautiful, integrated, unified explanation of what the action is. And I think you need to have a mindset that if you're open to the history and the traditions of other cultures, it's just going to make you a better leader, because Australia is one of the most multicultural societies on the planet. And I think anybody who doesn't have a good multicultural kit bag of tools to work with is going to be at a strategic disadvantage in the next 50 years.
Absolutely. But yet, we do see a bit of a misalignment there, especially, I suppose, in the context of business leadership in this country, right? There seems to be a very dominant culture that values a certain style of communications. So just to give you an example, during a job interview process, whenever someone talks about having great communication skills, they're almost exclusively referring to their ability to speak well. Notwithstanding the fact that 50% of communications is listening, we seem to have a culture that absolutely undervalues the listening side of that equation. Why do you think that is, though? Like, in a society as multicultural as Australia is, why do we place so little value on the societal level, or at least in the dominant culture, of how important that listening is?
A great leader told me once, the truth is always with the customer. And whatever the dominant culture is in Australia, I think that's interesting. But what's powerful and productive is, who are we working with that we need to form relationships with? There are more people on the planet, if you drew a circle from Pakistan to Australia and to Japan, than there is in any other part of the globe. This is the Asian century. So if you think about the past and think about the dominant cultures that you're referencing in Australia, that's what got us here. And let's be grateful, that's what got us here. But it's not what's going to help our country and our people prosper in the next 50, 100 years. So we need to become really skillful at explaining that the skill of listening in a job interview is as much about not answering the question as it is about answering the question. So one tip I would give everyone, if you're doing a job interview and you don't understand the question, don't guess it and answer the wrong question. One of the great ways you can role model communication skills is ask the person, is this what they meant by the question? And all of a sudden, they'll see you role modeling real time these excellent communication skills. And Jeffrey, you know this when you're dealing with your customers. It's very difficult for the customer to explain what they mean the first time. And let me give you a little bit of a commercial break from neuroscience. You speak at 125 words a minute, but you can think at 900. So there's an 11% chance that what the interviewer says the first time, or the customer, or your partner, there's an 11% chance that what they say the first time is what they mean. Rarely do we write and send an email immediately. We typically edit it. And yet when it comes to speaking, we all want to have a conversation with the first 125 words that come out of people's mouths. So a skillful person role modeling in a job interview or a sales situation or a consulting engagement or a medical consultation, just take an extra moment to go, hey, Jeffrey, that question, did you mean this, or did you mean that, or did you mean something else altogether? And that will get them thinking, because unless you're a well-trained actor who can read their lines and you're well rehearsed, there's only 11% chance that what you say is what you mean. So if you understand that, you can understand that the most valuable thing in commerce in the future will be your ability to communicate skillfully, not only in the dominant culture, but as we look overseas to other markets, how do we engage with them as well?
You're a proud child of two first-generation migrants, which I
Mm,
can certainly identify with because, I'm believe it or not, I'm myself a first-generation migrant, having left Taiwan at 10 and
mm,
moved to New Zealand into into an English-speaking culture where literally that's the first time I learned English.
mm.
So, listening to what you've just said and reflecting on my own experiences, I realized that it was through the frustration of having to communicate with a very limited set of words and vocabulary
Mm,
that I learned to listen for context, listen for words, and trying to stitch those meanings together.
mm.
I realized that it was because of that upbringing, it was because of my limited ability to communicate what I really mean that I've learned to listen between the lines to really figure out, what the person on the other side is trying to say to me. And that skill that I carried with me to my sales job today, because I understand that it's incredibly difficult for a customer, especially one that may not understand the technology, to voice exactly what is it that they want, and how, and so a lot of the time I realize when they're asking for A, what they really want is B, but what we have to do is examine, the motivation, the context, the all the other things inside it. So my question to you is that how much of your cultural upbringing affected your ability to listen, or impacted how, do you believe that you're a better listener because you're a child of two first generation migrants?
Oh, I think my culture is so multifaceted. So the reason I say that is my parents were modern Romeo and Juliet. So they were from the deep south of Italy and the deep north of Italy, and the only time they could have ever met is in Australia. I
Wow.
grew up in a place that was very close to what was called the Villawood Immigration Centre. It's now called the Villawood Detention Centre. So it tells you a bit about Australia's um, attitude towards migration over that period of time. I went to a school with 23 nationalities, and it was a beautiful melting pot of every war-torn part of the world: Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, South America, people fleeing Eastern Europe at the time. And I reckon one of the reasons why I was really good at listening was because of an Italian card game that we played at school. Now, by the way, I can't speak a word of Italian, and my parents were kind of tossed out of their families because they married outside their region. So I kind of grew up an Aussie in a very multicultural part of Sydney. And this card game is played in pairs, so two players on each team. So there's four players against each other playing diagonally. And sometimes I was the pickup player. Pickup in basketball is just the spare player that makes up the team. So I would make up the team. But they're speaking in their home language. So they're speaking Vietnamese to each other, or they're speaking Polish, speaking Greek to each other, or they're speaking Portuguese, the Brazilians, or they're speaking Spanish from the people from Uruguay and Argentina and Chile. And I was at this strategic disadvantage, except they lowered their guard when they spoke in their home language. I could notice where their fingers were going on the cards. I could see their eyes lighting up. I could see a very different inclination in their voice range and where the voice was coming from. But I only joined these dots many years down the track. The other reason I think I was a good listener is because
Mm.
when I was growing up, I had this very protruded jaw. So I was like, had a werewolf jaw, and I had braces for the best part of 5 years. So I would do everything to hide in a
Mm.
conversation. I didn't want attention drawn to me. And I discovered the easiest way not to draw attention to yourself is just to ask the other person a question. And I was a great question asker. And I think these early skills, but it wasn't until many years later where a vice president said to me, Oscar, if you could code the way you listen, you could change the world. And I was so grateful for that gift from Tracy, who said that to me one day back in 2012, that's the kind of journey I'm on now. So I think all those things have been elements in that. And I think it also gave me a little bit of an advantage at work because I could relate to the receptionist, the cleaner, the CEO. I could have conversations with all of them because in my background, I knew somebody like them. or I knew somebody's parents like them because of the area I grew up in as well. In fact, it was probably not until I went to university, Jeffrey, that I discovered the dominant culture wasn't multicultural, which
Wow.
was kind of weird for me when I went to uni the first time.
That is absolutely fascinating. And I really love hearing about that, because at the Professional Development Forum, one of our key beliefs, is the fact that, what you bring to the table should, your difference, your edge is one of our models. What you bring to the table should be what sets you apart. And for the longest time, I haven't actually worked out that listening could be a strategic advantage in my career, even though, now in reflection, I realize that it was. Um, as a salesperson, my secret power wasn't the gift of the gab. As a salesperson, my secret power was my ability to listen for meaning, for understanding, for all these things that you spoke about. So I guess for the benefit of our listeners, a young professional coming up the ranks now, they might be from a culture like yours or mine, where they may not have the ability to stand up and speak like Winston Churchill or or Barack Obama, but they know how to listen. They know how to gain understanding, even though they may have limited linguistic skills to express themselves. So, how can a young professional leverage their ability to listen in order to form a strategic advantage in their career?
Look, I went through my whole university without speaking a word to a single tutor, to a single lecturer, to a single other student. That's how shy I was. So one of the things I would say is you can't just do it with listening. You need to find your voice first and speak your truth. And as broken in English as that is, you'll get better by saying it. But the story you need to tell is your story. Your story is incredibly unique. So for all of us, the world misses out when we don't turn up and tell our own story. However disjointed we might feel it is, because it's your story, it's your unique story, there are people who are going to find fascination either in something similar to you or something that's different to you as well. So as just build your confidence up by telling one other person your story in the next week. Not somebody that you fear or somebody who's a higher up, just somebody who's a colleague. And that said, yes, you can build listening muscles as well. And listening is a way to separate leaders that talk a lot versus leaders that make a difference. I think great listeners are great synthesizers of the conversation. They're great summarizers of the conversation. So if you're in a team meeting and the leader in the room says, "So what do you think, Jeffrey?" Sometimes we freeze because we think they're asking us what we think. What I would say to everybody, if you could practice this skill, this becomes so potent. Summarize what you heard in the room in that moment where that leader asks you that question. They're not necessarily asking what you actually think. So quite often I would say when that happened to me, people would go, "Oh, what do you think, Oscar?" I go, "Look, we seem to have covered off very much an internal perspective on this. And I'm curious if a customer was in the room, what question we haven't explored fully that the customer might have asked for us." Well, the thing that's got me thinking about is we've spent a lot of time talking about the past and we've done a lot of deep root cause analysis on this problem. But I'm just curious, if we came back in 12 months, how would we approach this problem differently? And I was always there to create a contrast from where what I call the gravity in the dialogue was, and go, if they're always talking about the past, let me open their minds to the future. If they're always talking about internal, let me talk about external. Or let me offer a perspective to say, look, I think what you said is really relevant, but I'm not sure we've considered a female perspective, or I don't think we've considered a younger person's perspective, or I don't think we've considered a pensioner's perspective. And they'd always go, "Oh, there you go, always talking about the customer, Oscar." And it was something I was quite proud of, and always a bit shocked that people would go, "Well, why wouldn't you talk about the customer?" So when you're listening, you're not just listening for what it means for you. you can make a massive impact beyond words if you can help summarize where the room is and maybe create a perspective they haven't considered. I think that becomes a superhero power for the next 5, 10, 50 years as we look to the 18th century.
Wow. Now that is very insightful, and thanks for sharing that. I do believe, and as you alluded to before, it's incumbent upon us to articulate the value of what we bring to the table, such as our superpower to listen, to tell stories, to synthesize information, and to bring forth new perspectives. We cannot run from speaking. Even though we're good listeners, we can't run from that. And in fact, the only way that we can demonstrate that we're great listeners is by our ability to reflect back the conversation and to express ourselves. So that is definitely an insight that I'll take with me today. I'm really grateful for your time tonight and for sharing that wisdom. And we look forward to hosting you at an upcoming webinar at the Professional Development Forum, where I believe perspectives like yours, we need to continue to voice and get into the public sphere, because I believe, just as you do, that this is the core capability that's going to allow us to succeed in the 18th century. This is the skill that we will need for the future.
Jeffrey, thanks for listening.
Thank you very much.